demographic groups and how they're polarized, and how that fits into this overall partisan polarization. Okay, so now we're finally getting to what is it? And that's a very difficult question. So, you know, everybody will have an answer, or it may be, but they're like, oh, I know, it's really bad. Well, what is it? Is it people hating on each other? Because that might be different from this. Polarization, meaning going to the polls, is going to the extremes, which has an ideological sort of component to it, to say that my issue stance on these issues is further out on the right or the left than other people. And that's what this movement out to those extreme policy positions is what we could consider to be polarization. But how do you measure that? Is that separation between the parties? Like if you're going to just look at the difference in their policy stances and basically subtract them? Or is it, are people, individuals moving that way? Are parties moving a different way? And how do you measure all of those kinds of things? And that's a really big, messy problem within this. To add to that, if you take a sort of broader view of polarization, and I think this is what a lot of the public are thinking, to some extent they're thinking about issues, but there also is, people are just really mean. And that's certainly part of polarization. Maybe we don't want to call it polarization, maybe we want to call it something else, but it certainly is part of the overall picture of what's happening here. And there's a lot of different components to how you could possibly think about that. People are just really mean. How do you measure that? What does it mean? How has it changed over time? Are there different groups, et cetera, and why does it happen? So we'll look at a couple of the ones on the bottom of that in a minute. So the main debate that's going on in polarization is all about, if you might remember several years ago, the book that came out that was called What's the Matter with Kansas? And that just set off a firestorm of literature, both pro and con, as to what that's going on. And The Culture War is a book by Morris Fiorina, which I'm actually using in class right now, and what's really, really funny is that on some of the tests, the students are actually saying it's Morris Fiorina, and they're saying she. And I'm like, do they think it's Carly who wrote this book? So it's kind of funny. But yeah, so Morris Fiorina, he's the target, that Culture War book, where his premise is basically, as you'll see here in a minute, is that there is no culture war. That this polarization thing is all totally overblown. But amongst the public, so we're talking about the masses here, this is What's the Matter with Kansas was talking about. And that is to say, why are white working class, primarily males, voting Republican, which is not in their economic interest? Is it some sort of Marxist false consciousness thing going on here? Which is interesting that nobody in the political science field ever even asks. Whoa, can't touch Marxism with a 10-foot pole, which is really, really interesting that I've never read a single article in the hundreds that I've read that have said anything about false consciousness. It's weird. But if you read some of the literature, like I was discussing on a panel about Korean politics, that was really scary. Wayne helped me though. But what was interesting is that they were actually talking about this question. And even more interesting, of course, that they weren't afraid at all to talk about that false consciousness. For them, it turned out to be sort of regional cultural differences rather than a false consciousness thing, but it was really interesting to hear those Korean American and Korean who are studying here, grad students in the US, actually just, front on address false consciousness, whereas the rest of the literature is like, okay. So his argument is why that's happening is that these culturally divisive issues, race, religion, women's rights, gay rights, have risen since the 1970s and have been the driving force to separate out people's viewpoints. And that's why he said that we've become more polarized, and why in particular you're seeing white working class males move from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. So this is Fiorina's rebuttal. He's saying, no, that's not really true, that we're still all pretty moderate. He has a lot of data to show kind of aggregate, yep, we're still pretty much in the middle, a nice little bell curve thing going on there for tons of different issues, including abortion, by the way. to say that it's really what's polarized are the elites. And when you only have two choices between an extreme and an extreme, and you vote for them, then it makes you look extreme too. And we've got some other arguments going on there too, but that's kind of the major rebuttal to that. So this is really the big argument that's going on in the polarization literature, which has, again, set off this sort of firestorm. This is one of my favorites, the crazy uncle theory. And I really have seen this, so when I read this article not too long ago, I was like, yes, I've been seeing this for years in our data, and I just thought it was really weird. So one of the things is, so Free Arena is saying there's no culture war, and there's no real polarization, it's all just, you know, it's the elites, and it makes everybody else look polarized, but the public really isn't. But the question is to say, well then if we all are sort of centrist or moderates, how do you actually measure that? What makes for a moderate? And so one of the ways is that we just ask people, do you generally consider yourself very conservative, somewhat conservative? We leave out the moderate if they volunteer it, put it in there. Some other surveys, they actually will read it out as an option for them to pick, somewhat liberal or very liberal. The problem is, of course, that everybody wants to be a moderate. This is America. We're all middle class, right? So to say that you are a liberal, you know, is kind of a bad word. Nobody wants to be called a liberal. It's not as bad to be called a conservative. But, right, so having that sort of self-identification on surveys might not be that accurate. In fact, I stopped using the LibCon scale for a few years because it was so crazy stupid that people were like, I'm a conservative, but then they had all these like really liberal types of views. I'm like, I think you're thinking of a different definition of that than what it was. So along comes the crazy uncle theory. And basically what he says is, and the author of this study actually uses the example of the crazy uncle, so I just named the whole theory that. I don't know if you appreciate that or not, but and you probably all have met people like this, and again, I've seen this in our surveys, where you have people that have, and our students are totally like this all the time. They have an extremely conservative viewpoint and an extremely liberal viewpoint all at the same time. So an example would be, you have somebody who's like, yeah, I think there should be universal health care. At the same time, I think we should jail gay people. All right, so what is that person's ideology? So if you study it by taking the median, so if their score for very liberal is a -3 for that universal health care and it's a +3 for jailing gay people, then their median score is what?
0.
Go say, right? Oh, centrist. You're a moderate. Yeah. So what he's done, and I was pleased to see this because I had already done it in some of our data, was to use an absolute value. So, right, so his score should actually be a 6, which would be pretty extreme. So is it consistently liberal or conservative? No. And again, I have found this a lot, particularly among the people that don't have a lot of political knowledge and tend not to be as active, is that we find a lot of this weirdness that it doesn't really follow a sort of standard, here's what a conservative is and here's what a liberal is. So I think it sounds weird that like, how can you have these really, really different viewpoints, but they do. So that's one of the things that needs to be looked at more. So one of the other things that's interesting too, of course, is which issues are you picking? And I think a lot of times, most of these studies are picking the most divisive kinds of issues. And so in some ways, it makes it look bigger than it is. They're not really looking at all the issues that they agree on. So in my first simulation in my intro class, I actually did a simulation on congressional committee for looking at what's wrong with solitary confinement. And the bill that they were debating and looking at was actually bipartisan support for studying it, and that had pretty strong advocates on both sides. And this is something that's currently in Congress, because I really wanted to demonstrate, first of all, that you can disagree and still get along, and that there are many issues within Congress that are bipartisan, and by sort of cherry picking the most divisive issues and just focusing on that, right? So like the news, like all bad news. As I say, well, you don't read the paper and say, this is how many people all followed all the laws today. Right? So it makes it seem like we're a really bad community, when we're really not. So I think that is a big part of it as well. All right, so causation. One of the big theories, again, this is what those that actually do use some history put in there to look at the context. The argument there is that polarization is normal. That what we saw in the Beaver Cleaver 50s in many ways was the anomaly. The fact that we had so much bipartisan support for many, many policy issues in the 50s and 60s, or at least it was presented as such, was more of the anomaly than what we're in now. So some of the people argue that what we're in now is normal. If we were to look at the framers themselves, they were very, very divided. They didn't agree on a lot. How many times we go through the Constitution, we're like, oh, this is a when in doubt, leave it out, because they couldn't agree on it, so they just left it out. Or they make up something like the Electoral College, because they couldn't agree on how to elect the president. So it's important to remember that. And then there's that little issue called slavery. That was kind of divisive. And of course, that had cycles within it and was a very, very long period of divisiveness. And we've seen that throughout our history. So that's kind of a question, is that this is just sort of a normal part, but because we got so inured to our idea of bipartisanship, that everybody's freaking out as if this were horrible and that our democracy is going to die. So that's part of that hyperbole of freaking out when they're really not taking into account the historical context. So as we talked about, most of the era that we're talking about now is 1970s forward. The roots really are in the 1950s, of course, starting with Brown versus Board, and many of those sorts of court cases that proceeded through the 1960s, giving rights to African Americans, scared the crap out of the Southern whites. And they started to migrate toward the Republican Party as the Republican Party itself changed to try to peel those folks away from the Democratic Party. So, right, Abe Lincoln was a Republican. And so what we found is that during the 1960s, both parties were changing pretty rapidly in terms of what groups of people that they were trying to attract to their party. So imagine in the 1960s with the Democratic Party having hippies, anti-war protesters, civil rights advocates in the same party with George Wallace, who was publicly a racist, and he was also pro-Vietnam. They're all in the same party. So what I'm trying to tell my students too, because of course they have no idea about that, said if we were in the 1960s, we wouldn't be talking about the Republican Party, we'd be talking about the Democratic Party. And the 1968 election, where George Wallace actually peeled off part of the party and ran as a third-party candidate. And then moving into 1972, Nixon very consciously had the Southern strategy, where he just went after that group of folks to try to pull the Southern whites into the Republican Party. So that goes way back to the 1960s. It's certainly not something new, even though, again, it's talked about as if it were. Add to that LTGB, sorry, I always mixed that up. Gay rights, talk about women's issues. It's very, very threatening to a certain group of people who say, how can I compete in the workplace? Right? So, and the threat to what they consider the traditional family, as we move toward these issues, environmental protection, etc., they feel very, very threatened by that. And that pushes a lot of this movement toward polarization. Some people talk about it being gerrymandering, that redrawing the district lines has been a reason why the argument is that Republicans are just drawing the lines to benefit themselves. There has been dozens of studies on gerrymandering, and yes, there are some cases of political gerrymandering and also racial gerrymandering, but by and large, it's been ruled out as a cause for the current era of polarization. And one of the reasons why is that when you measure polarization within Congress, both the House and the Senate are equally polarized. there's no districts in the Senate. So that's one of the easy ways. There's been more complicated ways that they've kind of measured that, but that's kind of the easy way to look at it. Same with changes in primaries. For the most part, this has been ruled out as we have more party activists arguing that they have more power. But again, the end of the party boss era is like almost 100 years old when that sort of long transition. So to say that, oh, well, that's causing it from the 1970s forward, kind of doesn't really work. And again, there have been a lot of studies on that to look to see whether that's true. We do know that they're different from the rest of the population. They absolutely are. Have they been the drivers of this polarization, or are they sort of just a manifestation of it? And there's no agreement on that. Again, same with campaign finance. No agreement whatsoever as to how, particularly the 2010 Supreme Court decision to loosen up those campaign finance laws, how does that, particularly with conservative super PACs, how does that impact polarization? I think the general consensus is that it exacerbates it, but probably wasn't the cause of it. So this is, yeah, there's no agreement on any of this. I don't know the answers to any of these things. So, but that's something certainly the literature is trying to work out. But as we all know, getting at causation is really, really difficult. We have the authoritarianism model, and we'll talk about this next. This is an interesting, again, there's bajillions of theories about why polarization has happened, but I think there's a lot of talk about this in the 2016 election, so I wanted to kind of highlight this to look at it. So these guys published this book on authoritarianism as really one of the major drivers of polarization. They published their book in 2009 and basically predicted kind of a Trump-like candidate rising given the trends that they were seeing in this idea that they call authoritarianism. And what it is, it obviously with sociologists, psychologists, historians, political scientists, after World War II, there's a whole generation of folks that their single question was, why did Hitler happen and how can we make sure it never happens again? So that research started right after World War II, and it still continues today. There's still a lot of scholars who really focus in an interdisciplinary way to try to get at that. And what are people's predilections for an authoritarian kind of figure? So authoritarianism in this case is really talking about individuals and when, under what circumstances, might they vote for policies that are very extreme and or people that are quite extreme. So that's really, this is the definition of authoritarianism right there, that you can really look at people who really want order and that they really fear the outsiders. And there's a kind of an interesting debate that goes on as to, some people say that, well, really the only people that are going to be sort of triggered, most people, that there's a sort of a latent desire for order, and that you can sort of trigger people's hate of the other, but under sort of secure circumstances, when the economy's good, they've got a good job, nothing really bad's going on in their life, then that sort of tendency is going to remain latent. So the question is, well, for those who sort of score high on this authoritarian tendency scale, when is it triggered? There's another group, and including Hetherington and Weiler, they argue that even people who score low on the authoritarianism scale, that when there's enough sort of fear and threat going on there, that they also will be triggered. And that's when those folks, particularly the low authoritarian scale people, are triggered, is when you're going to see very, very rapid changes in movement toward both policies and political figures that are very extreme. So one of the things they look at is obviously a physical threat. So in today's election time period, obviously the immigrants as well as Muslims are sort of the targets of that physical fear. ISIS, Iran, those kinds of things. Even to some extent Russia and China, but not as much as we would see the sort of fear of terrorism and fear of immigrants. But there's also that social threat that we talked about. As we have the civil rights era, women's era, gay rights era, there's more and more threat to people who feel like they have traditional values. And as we add on top of that an economic recession that's very, very slow to recover from, There's huge amounts of both physical in terms of an economic threat to them, because remember, a lot of these folks are working class folks that see their jobs maybe going abroad or taken over by immigrants and women, that they feel both this sort of physical and social threat. And that's what's driving that support for more extreme policies. And that's maybe what a lot of people are talking about is sort of the Trump phenomenon, maybe based on this inherent sense of, or latent, or not so latent now, tendency toward authoritarianism. So to look at some of the data, when they studied this, they found 44% of white respondents were high or very high on the authoritarianism scale. And they actually said that was pretty normal. This has been studied, again, since World War II. They've been studying these kind of things and sort of tweaking the measures of it, but it's been, for the last probably couple of decades, the measures of it have been pretty standardized and also pretty hardy in terms of going under different tests and standing up, so they're pretty robust. So they actually say that 44% of people that are on that higher end of the scale is pretty normal. The question is, how many of those folks are triggered? Notice that there is definitely a partisan difference on the authoritarianism scale, that Republicans are more likely, somewhat more likely. It's not huge, right? I think 65% in an election outcome is really big, but it's really not that much more than majority. But as you can see, the lowest scores, there's quite a bit more of those folks are Democrats. Okay, Trump is polling at about 42% amongst all Republicans, depending on which poll you're looking at, but 52% among people who have a higher score on the authoritarian scale. Again, it's not huge, but it is statistically significant.